Great, so anytime you want to get started.
I have a handout. What I'd like to talk about are some experiences translating the poetry of the Tanzanian writer Euphrates Kezilahabi, whose poetry I've been working on recently. And what I especially wanted to share with you is a particular problem that I've become aware of in working with this poetry that I had never really thought through before. And then in my mind these last months I started to call the problem of breaking the metaphor. And what I've given you first on the handout is a poem in which this problem arose. And what I'll do is read for you the beginning of this poem in Swahili so you know what it sounds like. And then I'll read through the poem in English and show you where the problem happens. In Swahili, the poem is called Uvuaji wa Samaki Victoria, Fishing at Lake Victoria. And it sounds like this in the opening lines. And what I'll do is read through to the part in English where some teeth are being counted. Jana asubuhi ufukoni niliona watu wenye nguvu wasohuruma na walafi wakiimba na kuvuta kitu kirefu kutoka majini. Uzitocho ulionekana kuwataka mashindano, hata hivyo walivuta tu kwa nguvu zaidi. Sasa niliweza kuhesabu meno yao. And in English the poem reads this way. Yesterday morning I saw people at the shore, strong people, pitiless and greedy, singing and pulling something long from the water, the heaviness of which seemed to challenge them. Even so they pulled, harder now. I could count their teeth. I've never seen such a fierce tug of war between the warm-blooded and the cold. In the end the children of Adam triumphed and Neptune gave up the fight, for they were greedy beyond measure. Lifted into their control, thousands were lying now on the sand, flailing this way and that to escape the harsh rays piercing them. Impossible. They'd been charged with dirtying the drinking water. And for being tricked by the gleam of coins, the despots sentenced them to the cooking pot. I left. At 5 I went back to swim. Those people were still there, half naked. We do this 3-4 times a day, they said. I stood there alone in compassionate anger, sorrowing and crying, for those left behind to mourn the divers and the teachers of swimming. Kezilahabi, who was born in 1944, grew up on an island in Lake Victoria called Ukerewe Island. And like some other of his poems, this one draws on his experiences on the lake. There is, for example, another of his poems in which the speaker talks about hanging oars on a wall. And this is part of a larger figurative image in that poem, the hanging of oars on the wall. And this was a passage that I really struggled with, not lexically. I knew what had to be happening, but in terms of the line of feeling in the poem, I couldn't tell what the tenor of the line was when that happened. And it took a conversation with the poet in which he told me about growing up and going out on the lake every day and hanging the oars on the wall at the end of each day for me to understand the tenor of the lines. And I put these lines on the handout just to show you for a second before we get back to Fishing at Lake Victoria. These lines come from a poem that in Swahili is called Marhaba, which is hard to translate in English. Right now in English it's called reception. Marhaba is a greeting that I would give to somebody younger if they greeted me. So it's a kind of hello, but only an answer. It's never initiating, and it has this age difference, and it's a kind of acknowledgement. And the poem opens this way. Since we all come from the one island of one God, the benefactor, it's incumbent upon us to submit our complaints there. And it happens that to the extent we grow older and the troubles of life increase, so we keep remembering the oars we hung on the wall in youth and the sweat that trickled across our bodies. What happens eventually in this poem is that the we, this little community, goes paddling out looking for, searching for the one God. They hit some rocks. But you can see how in Fishing at Lake Victoria we have again a kind of idiom of a watery world and a speaker who's habituated to the shore. We have also another feature common to many of Kezilahabi's poems in Fishing at Lake Victoria, and that is the delivery of social commentary through the narration and meditation of a lyrical speaker. The story about witnessing strangers fishing at the shore is also a story about something else. And in the Swahili, the intent to deliver this commentary is signaled most forcefully midway through the poem, where the fish are being treated so mercilessly. The poem's lexicon there shifts towards one of crime and punishment in a way that's perhaps a little jarring in the Swahili. And so in English, we're around the line that says, impossible, they've been charged with dirtying the drinking water. In Swahili, walishtakiwa is the verb for they've been charged. And walishtakiwa is the verb that shows up in newspaper accounts of court cases they'd been prosecuted for or charged with or accused of. But it wasn't this verb, but the gleam of coins that raised the question about translation for me. In Swahili, the gleam of coins is meleto wa pesa, which on first reading I understood as the gleam of money, or even more abstractly, of wealth. And you can see how, with that phrasing, the terms of the lakeside story suddenly get left behind. The fish are being faulted most empathetically for being attracted by wealth. And this line made me worry, because it seemed to break with the scene that had been so carefully established in the preceding lines, to break rather harshly with it, if suddenly we have fish attracted by the gleam of wealth. That is, we know now for certain that it's not fish being talked about, because fish don't want to become wealthy. After some while of reflection, and really months away from the poem, so I put it away and didn't come back to it for about 6 months, it occurred to me that historically pesa, that Swahili word for money, could also mean coins, and that this is a viable contemporary translation still for the term, if not the most usual one. Also, shiny things like coins, if not coins themselves, and I verified this by talking to a couple of people, might be used by fishers as lure. And so I chose the term coins because it fastens the two stories, as I'm calling it. It fastens those two stories together in a way that wealth doesn't and money doesn't. But the experience left me with a question to ask Kezi Lahabi, and the question goes something like this. It's, how far are we into the figurative world in this line, and how far into the actual world of social commentary? Or how deep is the metaphor here? Which story are we more hearing in these lines, or more meant to hear? The story of a day watching the shore, or a story of exploitation by strangers? That is, what's the balance between the stories within the figurative language? And breaking the metaphor is an extreme term for the line as it now stands. The line in English, and for being tricked by the gleam of coins, doesn't really break it, although it stretches it some. But I also wondered about this. Maybe there should be a jarring here, or more of one. That might be what Kezi Lahabi intended, a kind of bumping into the real world of courts, of exploitative foreigners, of naive indigenous inhabitants suffering for their naivety and materialism. And it occurred to me then that Kezi Lahabi and I had touched on similar questions before with other poems. And I'm giving you one of these poems here. It's the poem called Flood. When we discussed this poem called Flood, Kezi Lahabi had to remind me of the tradition in Swahili poetry in which trees figure as people. And this is a tradition with which I was very familiar, but I had not detected this figuration at work in Kezi Lahabi's poem, which to me had read like one of his most plainly topical. I really thought that this was a poem that was just about some floods that happened in Dar es Salaam in a particular year, and that was a mistake. And I'll read you the translation now as it stands. In Swahili it's called Mafuriko, this poem. Flood in English. I'll write a song on the wings of a fly so that they play music when it takes off and many people hear. Let a poetry of the rubbish heap be sung about the sores of the farmers and their suppurations, their sweat. I'll write on the wings of insects all who take to the air, on the zebra's stripes and the elephant's huge ears, on the walls of bathrooms, offices, classrooms, on the roofs of houses, the walls of Ikulu, and on kangas and t-shirts I'll write this song. This year's flood threatens the oldest houses in the valley. Their inhabitants have begun to move out and the electricity poles have fallen. Where there was light, now darkness. This year's flood, an old tree leans sideways above our tattered homes. When the wind blows, we don't sleep. We're always checking its roots, its position, the house's fragile walls. Prune the tree right from the branches to the trunk. This year's flood is a warning. We'll be left telling our grandchildren, that year of the flood, many of our first trees fell. This year's flood, many of us will remember it. The ancient trees in the poem, Kezilahabi remarked to me, the ones that appear about 3 lines from the end, might be very old people. And I saw then that the adjective attached to the trees in Swahili, which is mikongwe, miti mingi mikongwe is the phrase, was more suggestive than my first translation, old or very old, or ancient I had tried for a while. But it was more suggestive than any of those translations, quite aloud. And in the end, I settled on our first trees. The sense with mikongwe is that it's something that's been there just forever. There are people who there's a person can be mkongwe, and the sense there is that you have no idea even how old this person, impossible to guess, or even to begin to guess how old this person is. So I settled on our first trees. First trees, first leaders in an independent state, first leaders of a political party. It was good enough. But that conversation left me with another question. To what degree was the Swahili signaling the presence of what we might call the second story, a story about the fate of a nation? And what lexicon do we have for measuring or for communicating the measurement of such a thing, the balance of figuration within metaphorical language? And to what extent is it possible to replicate in an English translation the particular poise in this respect of one of Kezilahabi's originals, the particular balance between stories or between levels of representation that's struck in a given figurative line? And one way of characterizing the problem, the question here with flood, would be by saying that it's the problem of breaking the metaphor turned inside out. So whereas with fishing at Lake Victoria, my question about translating metaphor first arose because of a sense that the English was breaking too forcefully out of the lakeside story, right? The first story was breaking too harshly towards what I'm calling the second story. With flood, my question about translating metaphor arose because of a sense that the English was insufficiently signaling the presence of the second story. And this made me think that here is a place where the literary translator's position differs from the literary interpreter's or scholars, because the interpreter can enjoy the feeling of both stories, of indeed multiple stories, and the multiple levels of representation and the flux and pull among them, and can make one argument or many arguments about how that flux creates meaning. But the translator, in having to set the text, sets the parameters in which the stories may operate. And however much a translator might enjoy that flux and pull, the translator does, she or he also inevitably has a sense of certain possibilities being more nurtured and of other possibilities being all but shut down through choices in translation. And the reason that all of this matters so much, I wanted to explain, is because of the tradition of using metaphor in Swahili poetry. Swahili poetry is more than anything a poetry of metaphor. And here I think it becomes important to situate Kezilahabi a little bit in relation to that tradition. And the next couple of poems are meant to do that. A little background on Kezilahabi. Kezilahabi was for decades a really polemical figure in Swahili poetry, and he became polemical when he published his first collection in 1974 when he was around 30. That book was called Kichomi, which means a kind of stabbing, agonizing pain. Kichomi. And it met with a lot of resistance among traditional Swahili poets. That is, poets writing and publishing in the centuries-old forms that were common in the language. This resistance has been energetic and sustained. In the mid-1990s, when I interviewed traditional poets across Tanzania, Kezilahabi was frequently mentioned as a problem figure, a turncoat, an enemy of poetic craft. Kezilahabi. But among other readers, both in East Africa now, especially in a younger generation, and abroad, he's understood as a figure of modernization and democratization, a kind of renovator of the Swahili literary tradition. For all the novelty and experimentalism of his poems, however, Kazilahabi's rejection of the dominant poetics results in a poetry that in crucial ways returns to old Swahili practices. For example, it's conventional for poets to address one another in their poems, and Kazilahabi does this very frequently. He also alludes to this tradition in a poem like Gentleness of the Cuttlefish, which I've given you here. In Swahili, this poem is called Upole wa Mkizi. And the title of the poem invokes the Swahili proverb, Hasiri ya mkizi furaha ya mvuvi. The anger of the cuttlefish is the fisher's delight, because the cuttlefish is said to be so furious when caught on a line that it flips itself onto the feet of the fisher, onto the very feet. And so you can see that Kazilahabi has turned the proverb around a little bit. Gentleness of the cuttlefish. We're afraid not to die, but to precede, sang the poet, and to leave behind even the dogs who thieve at the stove. I add, they are all killed, all of them. It's the voice of silence. You can see probably how, in a radically condensed and elliptical way, this poem invokes a Swahili tradition in which one poet builds upon the stanzas of another, sometimes in live competition. And these competitions still happen. Or answers another, sometimes in competition, but also in modern times on the pages of newspapers. And so we have the first voice, who's the voice of the sort of first poet, and then there seems to be the Kazilahabi poet, the I, who has something to add. But then, very characteristically for Kazilahabi, that second I voice gets transformed cryptically and almost immediately into the voice of silence. So you can see Gentleness of the Cuttlefish shows one way in which Kazilahabi's poetry uses traditional practices. And coming back to fishing at Lake Victoria and flood, another way that Kazilahabi draws on and invokes tradition is in this telling of two stories at once that I've been talking about. The use of metaphor, or of the giant metaphor in motion that is conceit, to communicate social critique or commentary. The workings of metaphor in a great deal of traditional Swahili poetry resemble the workings of metaphor in a poem like George Herbert's The Poli, or Emily Dickinson's poem about a train that starts, I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step around a pile of mountains. So with Dickinson, a reader understands the poet to be employing metaphor and recognizes the implied, though never directly stated, relation a train is a horse. In Swahili, likewise, the relation is not directly stated in traditional poetry. It's strongly implied. The riddle, though, is usually harder than Dickinson is trying to make her riddle. And I wanted to show you an example of this. This is a poem by a different poet, Winnie Hatibu Mohammed. He's a wonderful traditional Swahili poet who was born in 1920 and lived in the coastal Tanzanian town of Tanga. Winnie Hatibu loved and excelled at this kind of metaphorical poetry. It was his métier, really his specialty. And in a roughly versified translation, I'm giving you here his poem about a hoe, djembe in Swahili. It's worth keeping in mind here that any reader coming to the poem in Swahili knows upon seeing the title that something else, probably some kind of problem, is going to be talked about here, and that it's his or her job to figure out what it is. He or she also knows that he or she may never ever figure it out. In English, hoe, it has a sturdy handle, this we've known, uproots the thorns wherever we have need, and those who say it can't must stand alone. We know the hoe has never feared the weeds. No featherweight the hoe, it clears the plot, tears briars up, prepares the ground for seeds. Take it in hand yourself, you'll see I'm not just guessing. Hoes have never feared the weeds. It cuts the bush until the work is done. It loves to slice tough grass and slash the reeds. The hoe is guided, never overcome. The hoe has never, ever feared the weeds. And when it doesn't work, you can be sure someone's mistaken in intent or deed. It's tossed into the grass without a word, and yet the hoe has never feared the weeds. When Kezilahabi uses metaphors in his poems, those poems are very cognizant of and thinking about poems in this tradition that is being represented here by Mwenye Hatibu's poem. And when I was working a lot with poetry in this form, the Ho form, it's called the Shairi form in Swahili, I used to think of the poem's handling of figuration by using the word turn. So characteristically, in the final stanza, right, late in the poem, last stanza or penultimate stanza, the poem makes a move like the one in the last stanza here, that puts pressure on the sense that it carries a metaphorical meaning that its audience is tasked with understanding. So here the turn is signaled by the shift to you of direct address. Sometimes, depending on the poem, it's signaled by the shift towards a lyrical I. Mwenye Hatibu has a wonderful poem about a spider whose house is collapsing, falling apart. And, at the end of that poem, the turn comes when Mwenye Hatibu says, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what you're going to do about this, but I'm getting out of here. And that's it. So that's another kind of like, here's what I'm going to do. You should think about it for yourself. With Kezilahabi's poems, though, turn stopped seeming like the operative term for this pressure on the metaphor. There was more of the sense of breaking, the word I was using, or of sudden veering shifts enacted word by word in and out across levels of representation or figuration. Because free verse is still really rare in Swahili, conventions or habits for balancing levels of representation aren't well established. So a person doesn't just know where to look, like one does in a poem like Mwenye Hatibu's, to find the extra pressure being put on the metaphor. A person doesn't even know where it's most likely that pressure might happen. So there's a sense for the translator of a lot being balanced at a moment like the one in Fishing at Lake Victoria, where the speaker regards the fish flipping around on the sand, of each choice for a translator being ad hoc and custom made for that instance. And I'm not saying that this experience of the moment of idiosyncratic problem or of choice without precedent is unique to this project. But what I mean to convey is a sense of the kinds of balancing at work in a moment like deciding what pesa is, whether it's money or wealth or coins, or deciding how to describe the very old trees in flood. That is, how not only levels of figuration, relations between the stories are being balanced, but in this, and because of the really central importance of metaphor in so much Swahili poetry, in this, how Kezilahabi's relationship to tradition is also being balanced. And this is important for me as a translator, also because much of Kezilahabi, there's a large sort of segment of Kezilahabi's poetry that engages directly in thinking about the relationship between novelty and tradition. And there's a subset of his poems that defend his use of free verse in various complicated and beautiful ways. And so all of this, for me, raises the stakes, raises the sense of the stakes, I guess, at a moment like that one. I thought that before I stop for us to talk, I would show you just a couple of other things that are not breaking the metaphor. And one was, I wanted to show you a kind of classic Swahili verse translation problem, or classic, it's not verse, it can be narrative too. And I chose the word, the next poem here. The problem is the ungendered quality of the third person pronoun in Swahili. So of course there are ways of gendering, those gendering through qualification, you can say. Of course there are ways of gendering through qualification, but just the third person pronoun yeye is an ungendered, he or she, or it even. In Swahili, the noun class lets you know whether it's an it, an animal or a person. So there are ways of, Swahili distinguishes between it and he and she. But the he and she with yeye, it could be either one. And across a large body of poetry, this can create some complications. And I'm giving you a poem in which those complications operate a little bit. The poem is called The Word, and it has in it a figure who circulates in Kezi Lahavi's writing. Kezi Lahavi has published, I think, 6 novels, and he has a novel that's named for this woman, Nagona. Nagona is a cryptic figure, even in her own novel. And she appears a few times in his poems, sometimes named and sometimes unnamed. And she's associated, one thing we can say for sure about her is that she's associated with renewal at the personal and the national level. In Swahili, the poem is called Neno, the word. Poets guard the door, intractable ones, over there where that woman Nagona sits. They are champions of illumination. Their work is to catch hold of a hard word so it can be molded into meaning. They stand in its path if a hard word greets them from behind the door. Here comes a king of religion with his knowledge of the word, arriving directly from a massive new cooking pot assisted by experts. He'd like the door to stand open so that he can close it easily without dexterity and triumph in bearing in Lord. Now a president takes his turn, approaching with all the powers of government assisted by his prime minister. He doesn't want trouble with anyone. He'd like 3 words to pass: equality, freedom, and justice, which he enunciates masterfully. A chief justice comes in with his knowledge of the rules of the game, assisted by various judges. He'd like justice to be the last word. The situation is this: the poet can't be dodged, and he's not thrown off by feints, by lightness of foot. Rough players fear him, for he takes the word from their very heads. He puts the word into his heart, then composes a poem, easing, smoothing the way. Indeed, this is when he wears his diadem, and his shoulders are brushed by its ribbons. In this poem, in the original, nobody is gendered. So the Nagona is gendered at the beginning. But the king of religion, the various figures coming in with their various words, have no gender attached to them. Likewise, and importantly, the poet doesn't have a gender attached to him either. And in this poem, I chose to make everybody a he, because it seemed like the sort of least complicated of the possible choices. It's interesting, this poem appeared, and Kezi Lahavi has 3 books, and this is the middle one, Karibu Indani, Welcome Inside. And for this middle one, University of Dar es Salaam, which was the publisher of this one and not of the others, was using an illustrator, and there's an illustration accompanying this poem of a poet. This is with wearing a sort of headpiece. And I confess that I scrutinized the illustration a little to see if there were any clues in the picture about the gender of the poet. The other figures weren't there, but there weren't any. But you can see how across many poems, if you have all of these figures circulating who don't have gender attached to them, and have to assign gender or figure out, either assign gender or be responsible for the presence of clumsy notes, about not assigning gender, like that feels different. It feels like there's a lot of opportunity for breaking away from the worldview of the body of poetry, especially because Kezi Lahavi thinks a lot and writes in a number of poems about the position of women in society. So he likes it, and many, I think, Swahili speakers like it, that you can talk about a poet, or you can talk about God without assigning any gender there. God is another situation where this gender question comes up in English, and it's just not there in Swahili. There's no gender for God. I want to read you a couple more things more quickly. You can see in Neno something else, perhaps, is that Kezi Lahavi is a fan of soccer and the imagery associated with soccer. It's coming through there where he's imagining the poet as almost as a kind of soccer player, a football player, who's not thrown off by feints, by lightness of foot. And another poem in which this idiom comes in is this poem called the Bedbug Song. So I was going to read you this one, and then I was going to read you, you don't have it, but I do a happier poem about love, because this is kind of a glum one, the Bedbug Song, and then I thought I would stop. The Bedbug Song is an early poem by Kezilahabi. Wimbo wa Kunguni is its name. And in that title too, Kezilahabi is invoking tradition. There's lots of old, ancient Swahili poetry that goes by this name, Wimbo wa, the song of this or the song of that. And especially there's a sort of mysterious figure, almost a kind of poetic superhero in Kenya called Fumo Liongo, an ancient figure of legend who has many of these wimbo associated with him. Liongo's song of this and song of that. So that this poem is hearing that tradition. The Bedbug Song. In case you don't know it, human, marriage is a fowl near the goal. The whistle has blown, and the goal has no keeper, no one there, but the space between the poles is just a foot. Shoes split and the ball a block of cement. The field is a little hamlet inside the house. The cheerers, the jeerers, ever so many. Many questions like these, many murmurings like these, many problems like these now emerge, although once they weren't here. It's actually a handball. It's a specific foul in the original, but I didn't. I was advised by a couple of readers that it was too unfamiliar. That it wasn't clear what the handball was. Also with this poem, I was going to mention that Kezilahabi and I had an interesting conversation about the word Hamlet, which Kezilahabi wasn't familiar with. He knew it as Hamlet, he knew Hamlet, the character, the dramatic figure of Shakespeare, but not Hamlet, the little town. And when I explained what the word meant, Kezilahabi said to me that he asked me whether I thought readers in other African countries would know what this word meant. And I had no idea. And I realized at that point that when Kezilahabi and I envisioned an audience for the English translations, we were envisioning really primarily two very different audiences. That I think about an American readership, and that Kezilahabi was thinking about a kind of Pan-African readership reading in English. And I had never even, it had not occurred to me. That was not an audience that I'd had in mind at all. And it was startling to me to realize that when it seemed like a huge oversight. And without that conversation, I wouldn't have realized that we had these different audiences in mind. Okay, I was going to read you the more happy poem. Kezilahabi has some idiosyncratic and very lovely poems about love, so I was going to read you one of the later ones. This one in Swahili is called Tena na Tena, again and again. And you can see in it how important image is as a structure, or you can hear how important image is as a structural principle in Kezilahabi's free verse. So image and certain sort of aspects of grammar that can't be replicated in English become the two it's like crucial structural devices in this free verse as it moves out of the stanzaic form and the heavily rhymed form of traditional poetry. In English, the poem is called Again and Again. And there's a few blanks, so it doesn't fill itself in, and this was something that Kezilahabi and I had a conversation about too, where I kept wanting to make the sentences finish, and Kezilahabi would say, why are you doing that? Like they're supposed to want to finish it themselves. You'll hear it. The grasshopper leaps with its mate like a rocket ship, crossing the footpaths and the road to land safely in the grasses on the other side, avoiding the gaze of the birds and the lips and hooves of the cows who protect it as it gives way to them. Although it can't circle the world or land on the moon, the life of two together is like. If the python's mate dies, it denies itself food until its own death comes, and the dove perishes from sadness. The gorilla stays with the corpse for a week, not caring about the stench. The life of two together isn't like. Let's you and I count the stars until we forget how far we've come and start over once more. Again and again, two forever, we'll land safely on the other side. Okay, having redeemed love, I'm prepared to stop.
Fantastic.
I wonder what you think.
Really startling poems. I mean,
Really?
they're excellent poems.
It's like